I'm Bill Hesson for Prickly Pears, the Palm Springs Public Library's oral history project with pioneer Palm Springs residents, recalling with you the good old days. The date today is Saturday, December 20th, 1986, and we're located in the offices of Sanborn and Webb Engineering in Palm Springs. Our conversation will be with John Sanborn, one of those pioneer residents, a fellow who grew up here in Palm Springs. John, first, thanks for being with us today and sharing with us some of your memories of those early days in Palm Springs when you were growing up here, and particularly for sharing with us your knowledge of land development during the very early years, because I know your knowledge of that goes all the way back to San Diego County. But let's first talk about you. Where were you born?
Bill, I was born in Riverside. Actually, my dad was working in Palm Springs at the time, and my mother was living in Riverside as a school teacher, and he was commuting back and forth.
Oh.
He was doing some very early survey work down here, and I recall him telling us that he started surveying down here in 1922, doing some work for Culver Nichols up in Chino Canyon, and they drove up in a buckboard rig with horses.
Yeah. Culver is still doing work up in Chino Canyon.
Yes, I know.
Heck, he is. So you came down here in 1937 then?
Yeah, we moved down in 37 to a house on Villa Escuela, the north end of the community, and then in 38 we moved one block further north to Racket Club Road, where I literally grew up.
That was the house you grew up in?
Yes, and everybody has always asked, well, why did you live in the north end of town? Well, in the 30s there was no air conditioning, and we were year-round residents, and in the summer it was always at least 10 to 15 degrees cooler in the north end of Palm Springs than downtown.
Always a breeze.
Right. That's true.
That's a good point. And that's right, in those days there was no air conditioning. Did they have swamp coolers then?
Our first 3 years here in the desert we did not have swamp coolers. That was the big thing in 1940 when Dad put swamp coolers in the window, and they were the kind you put up in the summer and then we'd take them down in the wintertime. And that was our first cool summer, I'll say.
Well, at least the best.
Right, right.
Of course, they don't always work that well if it's humid.
Yeah.
It makes a difference. Where'd you first go to school down here?
I went to school, actually a preschool at a place called La Clase, which was down on Arenas Road in downtown Palm Springs, and some of my classmates were Jim Hicks and his sisters. Ironically, the house that we went to preschool, La Clase, at that time belonged to my future grandmother-in-law.
Oh, for goodness sake.
So didn't know it at the time. But
right down the heart of town. Who were some of the other people in class with you then? Do you remember?
A fellow by the name of Raymond Knowles, who now lives down in La Jolla area. Susie Watson. Gosh, I can't think of the other ones.
Yeah, well, that's a long time ago. And
then we went from there into Francis Stevens School, which is right on Palm Canyon and is now the senior center.
Was Francis Stevens structured with separate grades at that time, or were all the grades more or less in one room and taught by one person?
No, there was a wing which is on the north side of the building today, which housed I think it was the 1 through 3, and 4 through 6 were on the other side of the building. As you recall the structure, there's a big auditorium in the middle, and the administration office was in the middle, so the south portion of the school was the older kids, and the younger kids were on the north portion.
Was Earl Strebe still showing movies in the auditorium then, or had he built the Village Theater?
No, the Village and the Plaza were both built by then.
I guess they would then.
Yeah.
The Plaza, as a matter of fact, this week celebrated its 50th anniversary.
That's correct.
Which is a big event.
That's correct.
What do you remember about school in those early days as a youngster?
Well, I remember that Jim Hicks was there, of course, a fellow named Bob Hartley, who is developing a big RV park down valley. As a little kids, I know we played outside an awful lot. I do remember, I don't know, Bill, if you recall, there used to be a big wall all around that school, about 3-4 feet high. In 1940, they had a big flood, and the water came out of Tachiva Canyon and down through that area, and I remember as a little kid being carried out onto a bus with water coming underneath the doors. And after that, they built the wall around the school.
to keep to protect it.
Now the wall's gone because we have a big flood control protection in there now.
Was that a pretty well-developed area up through Las Palmas at that time?
Yeah, Las Palmas was fairly well developed. Most of those homes are still in existence today. At that time there was a place called the Colonial House, which was directly on the east side of the school, on the east side of Indian, which later became Howard Manor.
Mm-hmm.
That was existing, and all those lovely homes in behind there were all there at that time.
Yeah. Well, the wash you speak of would have run then, I think that wash is still there on the west side of Highway 111, and it goes underground under 111 at that
Well,
point
it's actually
into
underground all the way now.
the storm drain.
There
Wait,
was
is
an open channel at that time, those early days, and
Well, that's the one that comes down over that big rock fall up in the canyon, isn't it?
that's correct.
Mm.
That's correct.
What did you do for fun in those days as a little kid?
Well, as a little kid, since we lived up at the north end, and there weren't that many children in school anyway, it was just a relatively small school. There was only about 4 or 5 of us that played, which was a fellow named Bill Hotchkiss. His dad used to have the department hardware store with Licken in the later years.
Mm-hmm.
Ed Knupp, Jim Hicks, Ray Knowles. We kind of, as little kids, palled around together.
Hung out together.
And an awful lot of the time, you had to entertain yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we had a eucalyptus tree, and I used to sit underneath the eucalyptus tree and build dams and roads, and by myself a great deal of the time in those early, when I was just a little kid.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the fellas. Weren't there some girls in the school?
At that age, I don't think we were interested in girls.
You didn't pay any attention to
No.
that early.
I'm sure there were girls there, yes.
Who were your teachers?
You know, I really don't recall who my teachers were at that stage. I know that Catherine Finchy was obviously there.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Laurie was there. And I believe Mrs. Pete Peterson's wife was teaching.
Mary Peterson.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
she was teaching then.
And the school was just then roughly about the same size as it is now.
Same size as it is now. They had a cafeteria building over on the south side, which has been torn down. It's all lawn there now.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, the school is virtually the same.
Pretty much the same. What would you estimate? Maybe there were 40 kids in school then?
Oh, I think in our first grade class we probably had maybe 15 kids. So there was probably might reach 100 in the total school, 1 through 6.
The whole school district.
Yeah.
But you stayed there all the way through school then, and then you said you went back to Riverside for
Well,
a
I
couple
stayed
years.
the first grade, part of the second grade, and the Second World War came along, and we moved back to Riverside when my dad went in the service because Mother was teaching school, and so I was in Riverside from the second half of the second grade, third grade, fourth grade, came back here for the fifth and sixth grades.
I see. And by then you probably were just about ready for intermediate school or
Yeah, we had
junior high?
we came back to sixth grade, and then we went into Nellie Kaufman Junior High.
I see. Now, when you were little, were there available many of the things that so many kids took for granted, like ice cream in the store, and was there a soda fountain anywhere in town? that you could patronize?
As a first or second grader, I don't really remember.
You were pretty small.
I was pretty small. A lot of the times I know that we had ice cream in the house, of course, because we used to shop at the Safeway store in downtown Palm Springs. But some of the, I really don't recall. I know when I was in junior high and high school, there were some, quote, hangouts that we would go to for ice cream.
There would have been a few, I
Right,
suppose.
right.
But at that age, as you say, there isn't an awful lot of potential.
No, there wasn't.
Did you hike much, or?
Yes, even as a little kid, I couldn't get too far away from the house, but I did spend a lot of time with my dad when he was, that was after the city was incorporated, and he was the public works director. And I remember spending hours with him as he was at the big motor grader keeping the streets graded, and riding with him as a little kid, and that was a big thrill, of course. And then when they built the airport in 1940, E.L. Yeager was the contractor, and I remember that Mr. Yeager was a friend of Dad's, and going out there and And I got to spend a whole day on a bulldozer with the driver.
And your smile suggests that that was fun.
Yeah, it really was. You know, as a little kid growing up, that was a big thing.
What, your dad, you say, was in really the same business you're in now,
That's
civil
correct.
engineering.
That's correct.
Did he found his own firm here?
In 1945, after we came back from the service, he went in business for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been active ever since.
I see. But as a civil engineer, he would have probably known a great deal about land development in the area and passed a lot of that knowledge on to you.
Well, yes, that's true. And of course, you know, going through old records, which we are constantly going back and researching, back to the days when Henry Washington, the cadastral surveyor for the federal government, came through in 1856 through 58, surveying the valley for the railroads.
I see.
And so we've got some of those old records here in the office, a lot of the old maps that are duplicates of them, obviously not the originals.
Yeah, right.
Which are very interesting, and one of these days I'm going to put together a little dog and pony show about that. And
I hope you
keep
do.
threatening to do that.
But we're going to talk a lot about that before we wind up here. But when you came back then, where did you go to junior high?
Went to Nellie Kaufman.
Out on Bellardo.
Bellardo Road, right.
Or Bristow, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bristow, behind the high school.
Mm-hmm.
It's now part of the high school campus, but in those days it was a 2-year junior high.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to ride the bus in every morning and ride it home every night. I can remember, I guess I was in the 8th grade. I got a paper route from the Desert Sun.
The old Desert Sun.
And in those days it was pretty tough because their clients were pretty few and far between at the north end of town, and I think it lasted about 4 months, and I gave it up.
Would have been a little warm in the summer delivering that paper.
Right.
But then you went on through high school.
Went on through high school.
And you said along the way one of the jobs you got to make a living for a while, or at least support your own activities, was parking cars.
Yes. When I was a junior and senior in high school, particularly around the Christmas and New Year's holidays, several of the fellows from high school had the, quote, concession to park cars at the tennis club and the Racket Club.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember working a couple New Year's Eves at the Racket Club, which were very, very lucrative.
I'll bet they were.
You know, I think in those days, and still a lot of money, we made 75 or 80 bucks a piece at night. New Year's Eve.
Not too shabby.
Not too shabby in those days.
That was a month's salary for a lot of people.
Yes,
in those
that's
days.
correct.
Absolutely.
That's correct.
Did you park any famous cars? Or cars for any famous people?
You know, to me, I'm not, famous people don't, I'm not, I won't say impressed, but I'm not awed by them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I guess growing up in Palm Springs, they were always around.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember.
And in those days, they were around a lot.
They were around a great deal. I spent quite a bit of time at the tennis club because my parents were members, and at the Racket Club, where I learned to swim, incidentally, in the late 30s, 39, 1940, because that was the only swimming pool in that part of town.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I know we parked a lot of cars. I'll tell you who probably I was impressed with at that point, parking the car for Edelbrock, who made speed equipment for hot rods, and I was very much into hot rods in those days.
You still are?
And I still am a car buff.
Uh-huh.
And I remember parking his car, and of course it had the latest equipment, and to me that was a bigger thrill than any of the movie stars.
I'll bet it was. Did you ever get to spend any time with Charlie Farrell?
Oh yes, yeah, he was a friend of the family, and as a child growing up, we spent a lot of time over there at the Racket Club.
You were close to the club.
Yeah, we'd walk over.
Mm-hmm.
We'd walk over to the Racket Club and swim, and of course Mom and Dad were there quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. And so you got very familiar with that part of the scene.
Very much so, very much so.
Almost really from the beginning, I suppose.
Yes,
as far as your family was concerned.
That's correct. And it's ironic, we've been involved with the Racket Club and its growth through all the years. As they've added on to it, we've been involved in the development of that property.
Mm-hmm. How did the place begin?
Well, it's my understanding that Charlie and Ralph Bellamy are tennis players, and they came down here and wanted to play tennis and couldn't find a place, and they bought some acreage way out and the far North 40, you call it, and
out in the wilderness.
out in the wilderness in those days, and they built the Racket Club as kind of a getaway for the Hollywood crowd and a place to play tennis.
I would imagine it began, well, according to the reports I've read, it just began as a little tiny pro shop in one court.
That's correct. And
And every time more people showed up, they stuck another court somewhere.
then they had a bar, and then a dining room, and then some cottages for people to stay at, and
It became part of the tradition, though, I suppose, here in town. And such places do have long traditions if the people remain the same. They had a bartender I know who was there for a long time.
Tex, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, no Tex.
He was there for a long time. Of course, the dining room staff.
Sherman Hall was there for years.
Sherman Hall.
Right.
That's right. Sherman Hall he almost was the club for a long
Yes,
time, I think,
that's
to a lot of
correct.
people.
That's correct.
Charlie was the host.
And
He treated people-
Sherman was the guy running things behind the
But
scenes.
sure made it run.
That's correct.
And, I'm glad you mentioned him. I think he doesn't get enough credit.
No, he doesn't. And there's a fellow that has a lot of information in him, too.
Mm-hmm. That's right. No question about that. Where did you usually go with your folks when they would go out for dinner? Do you remember when you were little?
Yeah,
Do you have any favorite places?
Of course, the Chi-Chi was the standby.
Mm-hmm.
Erwin Schulman was a long friend of the family. When we got married, gosh, he sent us over a lovely big present when Kathy and I got married. But the Chi-Chi, the old Saddle and Sirloin, which was up across from, I'm dating myself, where the old police station used to be.
That's right. Well, the whole purpose of this is
That's
dating
right.
ourselves.
The Saddle and Sirloin and the
Dollhouse.
Dollhouse, of course, the Dollhouse was a great favorite place. The Palm House with Vic Sudea in the
Down the
later
south
time.
end.
Yeah. And 2 or 3 other places. Louise's Pantry, of course. Always Louise's Pantry.
Did Louise's Pantry exist as far back as you can remember?
Well, at least I remember high school going there.
Go there a lot. Well, I imagine it would have, because it was an intrinsic part of the Plaza Theater property.
Sure.
I think Earl felt that there was a need to feed people when they went to the movies.
That's right, and you come out and you can always go in there and get some ice cream and dessert after the show.
You still can. And of course, the line in front of Louise's Pantry now it's been famous for years.
That's right.
In fact, they advertise it in the
Maybe that's
basis
why I
of
don't like to stand in line anymore.
That's right. As a high schooler, what did you do for fun? There weren't too many opportunities to...
Well, you know, I have to laugh. I hear the kids today say, gee, there's nothing to do in town. Well, they should have been here in 1949, 1950. We made things to do. I remember friends of ours, the Delanos, who lived next door, had horses, and we did quite a bit of horseback riding. That's when you could. The stables was located really where the current new library is. That's where the stables were, in the polo grounds.
They called it the polo grounds.
In the polo grounds. And we'd ride Talkwitz Canyon a great deal and out in the desert. I was fortunate enough to have a car.
That always helps.
Yes, and even though it was one of my dad's old survey wagons, and I think he gave it to me rather than give it to the junk man, because he bought it from the Bureau of Land Management after the war, and it had 3 million miles on it at that point.
But wheels is wheels.
Wheels is wheels, that's right. But things that we did, I did a lot of exploring up in the Chino Canyon area. You know, I used to hike that area quite a bit. Talkwitz Canyon was a favorite haunt. After school in the late spring, we'd go up there and go swimming in a place called the Scorpion, which is a swimming hole.
They still call it that.
Yeah, you know, and it was a very, very popular place. Very much involved in school activities. We used to roller skate at the community church when I was in junior high and first year of high school, and that's where I met my wife. It was roller skating at the community church. And then in the summertime, we would go to Banning to roller skate. They had a roller rink up there, and a lot of us, we'd pile in the car and go up to Banning. And then, of course, we spent a lot of time in Idlewild. The parents had a cabin up there in the summertime. Got out of here.
Well, that's understandable, I guess. John, let's talk about your dad's work as a civil engineer. What kinds of things would he have been involved in?
Dad was a surveyor, land surveyor, not a civil engineer.
Oh.
But when prior to the war, when he was down here and actually worked for the city as the director of public works, we might say, he was involved in maintaining all the streets and the sewage treatment plant and things like that. And he also was working with J.F. Davidson Associates out of Riverside, and they were doing a lot of the development of the early subdivisions in the Palm Springs area. After the war, when he went in business for himself, I would say that he probably was responsible in the up through the mid-60s for 90% of the subdivisions that went on in Palm Springs.
Well, now let's backtrack a second. When you say the early subdivisions, what do you mean?
Well, I'm trying to think of.
Would that be like Las Palmas?
Well, Las Palmas was actually subdivided in the late 20s, early 30s. The subdivision behind what used to be called the Howard Manor is now the Palms. So that area was subdivided in the late 20s, up around the El Mirador. That was after the El Mirador was built. The area was subdivided, but a lot of in the 30s, the area south of Ramon Road and east of Indian Avenue was subdivided. Those subdivisions in there, and then right after the war, I know Dad did the first track for Truesdale, the Truesdale track, what we called it, which is right along the Tockwitz Creek, both sides of the Tockwitz Creek. And I'm trying to think of some of the. I know right after the war, really after the Second World War, is when things started to boom. The Veterans Tract was developed, which is the area east of El Cielo and south of Ramon Road.
Developed probably as a low-cost housing.
It was a low-cost housing. That's why it was called the Veterans Tract, ironically.
Right.
And then the big boom started when Jack Meiselman and George and Bob Alexander started doing the tract housing. Many of the subdivisions up all around the Racket Club, east of Indian Avenue, north of Vistachino, was either Jack Meiselman or George and Bob Alexander.
Remember the Alexanders' first small development south of Ramon Road and just a little west of the old Veterans Tract.
Yep.
I think that was the first one they did.
That was the first one.
Yeah. And who knew what was to follow?
Noel Clark came in and started subdividing we call the Ranch Club Estates, which was the property, the section bounded by Vistachino on the south, Indian on the east. And he built a country club out there. And he sold basically lots. And Desert Park Estates is what it was called, 1 through 12, I think.
But your dad was active in the development of all of that.
Yes, he was.
And at the same time, he worked for the city as public works director. You mentioned the sewage treatment. Did the city have a sanitation program in those days?
Yes, the city built the first sewage treatment plant in 1938. It was located at what we call the old dump site. If you read it, Ramon and Gene Autry, where the old city dump used to be, was the first.
Right by the airport.
Yes, was the first sewage treatment plant. That the city owned and operated until after the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, when the Army came in, they took over the El Mirador Hotel for a hospital, and they had the airport. They built a military sewage treatment plant, which is where the current sewage treatment plant is now located. And after the war, the government gave that plant to the city, and they abandoned the one on Ramon Road.
So actually, he had quite a bit to do.
Yes.
As you say, he kept the streets clean.
Kept the streets clean, because a majority of the streets in those days were dirt, and he'd have to get that grader out and grade those streets.
And go to work on it.
And then Saturday morning, we'd go out to the sewage treatment plant, and he'd maintain that, and whatever he had to do out there, I remember that. And
well, how did you develop your interest in land development in the area? I know it's almost a hobby of yours, an avocation.
Well, I guess when you grow up in it, you know. I remember growing up in high school that Easter vacation would come along and everybody would go to Newport Beach for the week. I'd end up on a survey crew.
Doesn't sound like much fun.
It wasn't much fun, but I guess when you grow up in the business, and it's something I enjoy. I enjoy working, number one, with people, and I enjoy
But
seeing
your dad
things.
let you work with him a little too.
Oh, you know, I really, unfortunately, didn't know my dad as a small child growing up because he was working all the time. And only after I went to work for him did I really become to know him. And he and I were inseparable.
Yeah.
I had probably the finest relation anybody could have with their father.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I was.
And undoubtedly that is responsible in large measure for your interest.
Yes, there's no
in
question.
history. What do you know about the earliest land development that occurred here in the valley? I suppose the earliest began with the Indians, but the Indians they didn't see any need to organize land.
No, they had basically the two villages, one down where the spa is and the other one up in Andreas Canyon. But the first, we'll say, survey came through was Henry Washington in 1856 through 58, when they sectionalized the whole valley, and this was getting ready for the railroad to come through. Then the railroad came through, and the government gave them, I believe it's every other section 20 miles either side of their ultimate right-of-way.
Let's pause for a second, because you've got something I want to show our viewers. You mentioned Washington and his surveying and so on, and you have a little relic I think they'd be interested in seeing. Right here in your office, John, you have a relic that goes back almost maybe 120 or 30 years.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, to the lay person, it looks like an old fence post. But
That's what I would have thought it was.
but to a surveyor, this is one of the original mesquite stakes that Henry Washington set for a section corner when he was surveying in 1856.
In 1856. Now, how do you know the date?
Because of the records.
Oh.
And his records are very meticulous. It tells exactly what type of stake he set at a particular section corner. This particular stake we found over near the base of Edom Hill across the valley, near the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. And we were doing some survey work out there, and we replaced it with a modern iron pipe, which probably won't last as long as this has.
What kind of wood is that?
This is mesquite. It's was hand hewn out of native mesquite from the area. Fortunately, the area out there is very dry. You can see it's very well sandblasted through the years. But
when you picked it up, how did you know what it was?
Well, again,
I mean, how did you know it wasn't just a...
Okay, by the location, when we surveyed it out, number one, it's, as you can see, it's very rectangular. It has been hewn.
So you could tell it had been
just was not a post.
cut to shape.
By the description in his original field notes, and if you look very carefully on here, you can see some, yeah, they're pretty hard to see in here now, but the post was scribed.
Was it?
But the sand is pretty well sandblasted, the scribes off. This side here was the one that was least exposed. But in surveying,
I imagine if you were determined enough, you could find that.
yeah, I'm sure you could. But in surveying, when you're coming down, you know a prescribed distance and a prescribed bearing that you're going on, and you come to this sitting in a mound of rocks, and what it was sitting in a mound of rocks, and which is very typical of what was set in those days.
The way they did it in those days.
And what was prescribed in his original field notes.
Now, when they planted stakes like that, what did they use for their basic reference point? I know now we use San Bernardino Basin Meridian. But,
well, there was the same thing. The San Bernardino Basin Meridian had been established, I think, about 20 years prior to that. And the survey was brought east from that initial point, which is up on the side of Mount San Gorgonio.
With the equipment that they had to work with in those days, how could they be as accurate as they were?
Well, you'd be surprised how accurate you can get. I've got one of their early instruments at home. I won't leave it here at the office, which is an 1856 Transit, much larger than the ones we use. Of course, today we use entirely different type of transits, but the workmanship on that particular instrument, and particularly the vernier, as we call it, where the degrees, minutes, and seconds are marked on the plates, is very, very good. And they, of course, they were all handmade and probably much better than the machine-made ones of today.
Really?
I think so, you know. I'm old-fashioned. I don't know how to use the new ones, though.
Well, this has always interested me, how somebody out in an open wilderness, as the desert was in those days, with his closest reference point as far away as San Bernardino, how they could conceivably divide the land into sections and parcels and as accurately as they did.
Well, what they did, they brought the survey from the meridian this way to the east. You know, you're speaking of that, how do you know where you are? Let me digress for a second. We were doing, Dad sent me out on a survey party in Utah for a fellow by the name of Ray Ryan, who had some mining claims.
And Ray Ryan, who used to own the El Mirador
That's correct.
And built Bermuda Dunes.
And that's the fellow. And we went up to Utah, and we were out in the Green River area, which, according to the data that we had researched in Salt Lake City, was unsurveyed. Now that may sound funny this day and age, but surprisingly there are areas in this country that are, quote, unsurveyed. And we got our initial point by shooting the North Star, shooting Polaris, to establish where we were, just like a navigator does aboard ship. And that's basically what surveying is. And from that we established where we were in the Green River country, and we were able to file the mining claims.
So what you're saying is the surveyor always knows where he is.
He better.
If he doesn't, we're all in trouble.
Right, right.
Well, so then getting back now to your narrative, Washington would have been the first real surveyor who worked through this area.
That's correct. He came through and established the sections up to, we call it toe of the mountain, because he did not go on into the mountain areas. That came at a later date by other cadastral or government surveyors.
What does the phrase cadastral mean?
I knew you'd ask that, and I've forgotten.
Means a surveyor.
That's right, right. But the early township plats, which were of each township, which is an area of 36 square miles, indicated that the original government surveyors only went to the toe of the mountain. And they are some very interesting to read, because they outline various major creeks that they crossed, Indian villages, springs, trails, some of the early wagon trails. And I know the one that is interesting for the Palm Springs area has, I think it's the 1902 survey, has the Indian villages located, the spa area where the spa is now, for the hot pools, the old trail in and out of Palm Springs, this marked trail, which was the road, and the Chino Canyon Cone and the Tockwitz Creek are all designated.
I see.
So there's some interesting history. You take these and you start back from the Washington, and then and that was 56, and then there was another one about 1870, and then another one about 1890, and they keep up creating them in those days.
Well, probably the most important event as far as land development in Palm Springs came when the government, as you mentioned earlier, decided to give the railroad the alternate sections.
That's correct.
Do you have any idea what the philosophy was behind that?
Well, number one is my understanding that to encourage number one, the railroad got all this land. As you know, the second largest landholder in the country today is the Southern Pacific Railroad. The federal government being the first.
And Southern Pacific is the
Southern
second?
Pacific Railroad is the second largest landholder in this country. This all comes from this government grant. And what it did, it encouraged the railroad to get their right-of-way through, and then they would hopefully encourage people to come, and they would develop communities on railroad land, sell it off. Well, that happened, for example, here in the Coachella Valley in the Palm Springs area, when this was part of San Bernardino County. The railroad sold and encouraged...
Oh, you mean San Diego
Or
County.
San Diego County, yeah. Thank you, Bill. I was thinking San Bernardino Basin Meridian. When this was San Diego County, the railroad sold off several sections to we call him today an entrepreneur, who came in and divided this area, the non-Indian land in and around Palm Springs, in a tract called the Palm Valley Colony Lands. And these were 20-acre parcels. And the pitch was you can come out and plant your trees and have your own little ranch. And he went so far as to build a narrow gauge railroad from the Garnett area over to what is now Smoke Tree Ranch, and I think you know where the ruins of the old railroad station are at Smoke Tree Ranch.
Mm-hmm.
When I was working for Dad as a surveyor in we call it the Ranch Club area up in Section 1, where that original railroad alignment went through, surveying along the section line, we found a lot of the old small narrow gauge railroad ties from that original railroad.
Now, who was it that did this? Do you remember?
I don't remember what the name of the chap was who did it.
Who built the railroad?
And I think the railroad lasted 2 years and got washed out and never rebuilt it.
Well, he'd have had to cross the Whitewater Channel.
That's correct.
Which would be risky now.
Yeah, and it crossed the widest point of the Whitewater Channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was a gamble in those days, and then when the Riverside County was formed.
Now, at this time, San Bernardino County was the only legal authority.
San Diego County. You're doing it now.
No, I'm doing it.
San Diego County. This Riverside County was formed out of San Diego County and San Bernardino County.
Mm-hmm.
And when those two counties were broken up to form Riverside County and Imperial County. But at that state, this was part of San Diego County.
Now, what would have been the effect of San Diego's influence in the area in those days as far as development was concerned? Would there have been a planning commission that had to be consulted?
Yeah, I doubt it very much. You know, I think in those days the surveyor would come out here and he'd map an area and walk it down to county seat and say, record this map, and it becomes an official map.
Oh.
Because even the original Palm Springs town site, which is downtown Palm Springs,
Mm-hmm.
was recorded in San Diego County.
I suppose the county would have been important, though, the Hall of Records, because that would have shown who owned what.
That's correct.
And where your property began.
That's correct.
So to
Everything had to be transacted in San Diego County. Of course, you know, in 1880, 1890, that was a long haul from here. It was probably a 3-day ride.
Yeah, I suppose it was. But what you had then, after Washington got through, was effectively a checkerboard.
That's correct.
Where the Indians owned all the red squares.
That's exactly right.
You know, in a sense.
Yeah.
I wonder what the government's thinking was in leaving the reservation structured in that way. I don't think there's any other reservation anywhere like it.
No, I don't know what their thinking was, other than at that point I'm sure the bureaucrats in Washington didn't think much of Indian policies. I'm sure they were second-class citizens at that point in time, in their eyes.
Yeah.
And they kept the better parcels for the white eyes.
Yeah, I suppose. But still, they wired them inextricably into the entire community.
Oh, no question. No question.
But this had a kind of an odd effect on growth, didn't it?
Yes, it did, because the non-Indian land developed first, because title was easy to transfer. People could buy and sell it. You did not have to deal with the Indian Bureau. And in fact, it wasn't until, I guess, about 35 years ago, that the federal government came in and actually allotted Indian land to individual Indians.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was right after, well, it was longer, probably right after the Second World War.
In the 60s, I think, if I
Yeah.
recall.
Although,
when they had the big reorganization.
right. Although Section 14, where we're sitting right now, was broken up, gosh, the Weir map, I think, is 19... No, that's after the Second World War. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Called the Weir map, which subdivides Section 14, which was Indian land.
Mhm. What did you do, John, in those days if you had to, if you were developing something that required crossing a lot of land, and you had to cross Indian land and government land of one kind or another? Was it as difficult then to get your clearances and get things arranged?
No, it was pretty simple. You just went and did it.
And after you did it, you went and told them.
That's right. That's basically what happened, you know, in a great many of these things, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking here of things like that aqueduct that they built to carry water from Whitewater.
Oh, that P.T. Stevens built.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I know. I'm sure that in those days, you just went out and did it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the Old West, you might say, and we'll shoot first, ask questions later. And if it hadn't been for that attitude, great portions of this country would never be developed.
I suppose that's true. What did they do about, we've talked a little about the development of water in the area. But going back to the earliest days with the judge, where did he get the water for his orchards?
Okay, that came out of, there were two basic areas that supplied water to the old Palm Springs town site, I'll call it. One was the P.T. Stevens Canal from Whitewater Canyon, which came down. The other was out of Tockwitz Canyon. And there was a weir built out of Tockwitz Canyon, which I can remember very distinctly as a kid, that it went through the now the tennis club, what is now the tennis club, went around the toe of the hill, down through the Desert Inn, across Palm Canyon, across Indian Avenue, and into Section 14 to supply water to the Indians. It was called the Indian Ditch, the Tockwitz Ditch.
Would that wouldn't have been the primary Tockwitz channel, would it?
No, it wasn't the river. It wasn't the Tockwitz. This took water out of the mouth of the canyon. They picked it up in a weir at the mouth of the canyon and conveyed it in a canal. And that was in operational up, I would say probably the early 50s. And I can remember water going through the tennis club. It was quite a thing because they kept trout in it. And you can go out and fish for trout for dinner. And that was quite the thing at the tennis club. And then the old Bank of America in downtown Palm Springs, the building is still there. It's now, it's across the street from the Desert Fashion Plaza. Along the side of that is where the canal went.
Right through the middle of town.
Right through the middle of town, underneath Palm Canyon Drive and underneath Indian Avenue, and deposited basically about the center of where the Spa Hotel is.
And that was the essential water supply.
That's the early water supply. Then the Alvin Hicks came along and developed the Palm Springs Water Company and brought water out of Chino Canyon and out of Falls Creek Canyon in a pipeline. And that was the real first domestic water, we'll call it. The rest was open canal water, but this was piped water to the valley, and built the first reservoirs and the real first domestic water system. And that has subsequently become the Desert Water Agency.
Who were some of the more important people involved in land development in the early days, as far as you know?
Well, as a small child, I don't know too many of who the early developers were, but as when I got involved with Dad, even at the high school level, we were looking at the Alexanders, the Meiselmans, who probably were the first real tract builders in the valley. I'm trying to think of the fellow who built the dream homes. Can't recall that. Of course,
Walker Bolts.
No. Yeah, Walker the Dream Homes. I mean the Veterans Tract, which was in 45. Gosh, just ring.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, and then after that, of course, Walker Bolts came along and built the Dreams homes. I can remember doing soils tests for that project. But how
about roads and highways in the earliest days? How did they lay these out?
Actually, the original roads followed wagon tracks, which were, you just take off and we're going from A to B, and they tended to stay along the toe of the mountain. And the reason for that was that where there was a wash, if they had been out in the valley and the river had flooded, as the river gets into the valley, it spreads out, and they would have had to rebuild a much larger portion of the road than if they're near the mouth of the canyon, where the road was very narrow. Then they just have to rebuild a portion of that.
I see.
So that was the philosophy of the early trails, basically along the toe of the mountains.
Well, when downtown Palm Springs was being developed, of course, you had Palm Canyon Drive with, as you said, it was a trail originally. And then only gradually became developed as a roadway.
Well, the original Palm Springs town site, again, was a subdivision that was recorded in San Diego County in their map book 4, page 652. I can remember that one distinctly. And that was an original San Diego County subdivision.
How big was it?
It was basically a half a section. It was from Alejo to Ramon and everything east of Indian Avenue. Or west of Indian Avenue, excuse me.
How much of the development would have already occurred by the time that was done? Would any of the original structures have been built then?
I doubt it very much.
I'm thinking of things like the hotel and...
No, see, because that was developed in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, and I'm sure that the judge, in fact, the judge may have been the original developer of that tract. I don't know. I'd have to go see who signed the map.
But this was developed then initially as a tract.
That's correct.
The downtown part of Palm Springs.
It's a subdivision of lots and blocks. The original street names were Orange and Lemon and Lime and like that.
That's right. Well, we talked to Phil Boyd on a different conversation not long ago about the naming of the streets when he and a friend of his walked through the downtown area and decided what they wanted to call them.
That's right.
And named them for members of the Indian tribe. But as far as the development was concerned then, the actual location of streets and the size of streets and the size of lots and blocks and so on depended on the whims of the original developer, whoever that was.
That's correct. And it was done, there was obviously some thought in it, the way it was subdivided out. It wasn't a hodgepodge, it was very geometrical, and probably pretty good planning. Today it seems to work well.
Now, what would have happened when Riverside County took over? What changes would have occurred at that time?
Well, the records of San Diego County that are in the new county would be transferred to Riverside. Whatever new ordinances and laws that were put in place as far as land development would then affect this area. It made it much easier for people to do county business now, obviously.
As far as you know, did the railroad ever exercise any influence in the development here?
No, I don't.
They owned all this property.
Yes, but see, they sold a lot. The Palm Valley Colony lands, they'd sold that off in the 1880s, these sections off, so that they really didn't have an interest in them at that point.
I see.
I'm sure they were happy when they tried to build the little railroad from Garnett over to Palm Springs, because that would generate business for the railroad.
Yeah.
But that washed out, and you had to bring everything in by buckboard from Garnett.
Yeah. So the railroad really never played much of a role as far as actual development was concerned.
Not to my knowledge, no. It was, I think the real thing that moved this valley was in the 20s when the Hollywood crowd found it as a getaway place. The road was paved to Palm Springs. The highway was built and the bridges, etc., and opened it up so it then was not a 8 or 9 hour drive from Los Angeles. It became, in those days, probably a 3-hour drive.
It's true. Prior to that time, I know some people we've talked to said it took all day.
That's correct.
To get down here. And they had cars.
Oh yes, I've got some pictures of my in-laws stuck in a washout out in the Whitewater area.
Well, that still happens sometimes. Right. How about the highway out there? Do you have any records indicating when the highway would have been built?
Not, yeah, I'm sure I know I have some maps in here, yes. When the county built 111, picked it up, the right-of-way map I have, I think, is about 1924 in that era. And then, of course, it ultimately became a state highway. The original highway coming into Palm Springs basically follows 111 now as you go around Windy Point, and then it turned and crossed the railroad tracks. In fact, the original road is still there where you, just west of Windy Point where you can cross the railroad tracks. That's where 111 used to cross the tracks, and it was an elevated, it was a crossing like there is today, in fact the same basic road. And then ran parallel to the tracks, and the old Palm Springs station used to be out there.
Oh, I remember that.
And then it ran up to what is about the Whitewater Ranch, where it met old Highway 60.
Would most of the longer roads that ran through the valley then have run along the section lines? Was that the way that early developers liked to do it?
Yes, basically yes, with the exception of Highway 111, and that ran diagonally down through the valley and followed the old trail, the old wagon route. But the north-south, east-west arterials are all on section lines. Ramon Road, Indian Avenue, Vista Chino, Gene Autry, Palm Drive.
They would have provided most of the transportation. I'll bet they were all dirt roads, though.
Oh yeah. I remember when I first got a car that when I left high school, I had to, if I wanted to go on Sunrise Way south of Ramon Road, It was dirt all the way over to 111.
Sunrise south of Ramon.
Yes. It was
Down
dirt.
where the civilized part of the...
That's right. Going across there was dirt, and then it finally got paved through the wash, I guess, in the early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
But
well, Vistacino east of Indian Avenue was a dirt road.
yes. Yeah.
Although
in
it
fact,
was the site, one of the early fun plus spots that I've heard
yeah,
about.
there was a place called, it was before my time too, called the Cane Breaks out
Cane
there,
Breaks,
which
yeah.
was quite a popular night spot.
Mhm.
I used to go hunting jackrabbits out in that area,
Mm.
along the old cane breaks that were literally there. It was great jackrabbit hunting. Take a 22 and go out there hunting. Nobody ever bothered you.
Mm.
And actually, that whole area out in there was a great area for sidewinders. When we were surveying in there for the Alexanders, I had never been in an area that had so many sidewinders.
The early surveyors must have run into a lot of those.
Yes, yeah. I've seen my share of them.
There was a reason for those leather
Yeah,
casings they wear on their legs.
that's correct. That's correct. A sidewinder's an interesting snake. It's the only aggressive rattlesnake I've ever seen, and we have come across, in personal experience, 2 snakes which were aggressive. Normally they'll, if you leave them alone, they'll turn and go away. But we've had, in 2 separate occasions, where we've had the snake come after us, and we'd move off, and he typically, you'd think he would go back to his hole or whatever. And he'd stop, and then we'd stop, and then all of a sudden, here he comes again.
And you hope you can outrun him.
You hope you can outrun him or have a big shovel.
A very big shovel. Or something handy.
Right, right.
What were surveyors mostly busy doing in those early days as the town developed?
Doing the subdivision work, laying out the blocks in the lots, the streets, getting them ready for construction so the contractors could come in and build them.
I see.
Water lines, sewer lines, etc.
They must have had some interesting assignments.
Yeah, there were.
Working for people like P.T. Stevens, for
Yes,
example.
I'm sure they were. I know Dad, in the stories he tells me about Culver Nichols and P.T. Stevens and some of the early people that he had worked for.
Mm. It was an interesting time. You've got some pictures I want to take a second to show the people who are sharing this
Sure, Bill.
conversation with us. Let me go over and focus the camera in on those a little more closely. John, if you can just sort of hold that up right now, just about the way you've got it, we'll see if we can get in close enough while you tell us what we're looking at.
Hey, Bill, this is an aerial photograph of the Upper Coachella Valley, taken as near as we can tell in the mid to late 20s.
Now, what canyon would we be looking at
Let me
there?
get around if I can see here. Okay, this is the Palm Canyon area in here, and this is the Palm Springs Center Village right there. Chino Canyon is back up in here, and then this is going up the pass, and there's the Whitewater River, as you can see, coming down through here. You can see in here very little development. Right there is the old airport, which was built on Section 14, which is about a half a block from this office.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember the big thrill I had is flying out in American Airlines in 1941 in a DC-3 off that dirt airstrip. They did a promotional down here, and Mother and I got to go along.
Let's see if we can come in a little closer on that. There, I think we've been able to move in a little closer now,
Okay.
and we can actually see that area a little bit better. Right where the town was.
Right there. Can you see that all right, Bill?
And we can see the airstrip there.
Okay.
Now, what would have been the date of this?
As near as I can tell, it's in the mid to late 20s.
Mid to late 20s.
Right.
So even at that time, there was an airport
Yes.
working in the area.
Yep.
Let's zoom back and show a little more of the picture now so that people can orient that a little better and see approximately what it looked like around Palm Springs. Through the pass, you don't see any sign of a road.
No, there's one there, though.
Well, I guess there'd have to be.
Yep.
There'd be
Good
more
road
than
coming
one.
in. In fact, you can see the spreading base in the Whitewater River is rather large.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Dad told me in 1938 in the big flood that Palm Springs was isolated, and they were flying bread and milk into that airport for about 3 days for the citizens here.
Okay, let's look at some of the other pictures that you have there.
Okay, Bill, this is almost an overhead aerial of the Palm Springs from 1939, 1947, 1971, and 1975.
Well, let's begin in the corner up there.
Okay. Let me grab your pen here.
The one that says 1939.
1939. You again can see that the old airport that we talked about in the downtown Palm Springs area, and this would be the Palm Canyon over here, wrapping on around Cathedral City down about here. Again, the village, right in this general area.
And there's the airport, and of course that's Palm Springs, right in the center of the screen.
Now we moved to 1947, again using the old airport as the orientation. It's right there.
Let me find the right picture here.
Okay.
Okay, now we've got that full screen.
Okay, now there's the same old airport. And again, the village, you can see it's grown substantially. And of course, the new airport that the military built in 1940. And then, like talking earlier about the Veterans Track, which is right in this general area in here. And you can see part of the old military reservation around the airport.
All right.
Now we move to 1971. Again, orientation. The old airport and the new airport. And we can see the Noel Clark started the Ranch Club Estates out in Section 1, which we talked about a few minutes ago, and in the Palm Springs area, and the starting of Canyon Country Club down in this area. Palm Canyon in 1975. We move up another 4 years, and you can see additional growth. There's Walker Boltz's track, and the two airports. The old airport's pretty well gone now. You can barely see it.
And where was the old airport again?
Okay, it was right about in here, this general area. Right there.
All right.
And you see the Canyon Country Club, the fairways. Seven Lakes Country Club out in here, and Palm Springs Muni Golf Course was built then.
Yeah. Amazing. Kind of gives you an interesting understanding of what the place looked like in those days, and what a neat idea to put those four things together so that you can really compare the way growth and development occurred from 1939 on.
We're going to try to do another series to take it from 75 up to date.
But those were the interesting years.
Yes.
Interesting, John. Looking at the picture they really show you of how land has been utilized in the area. And one other question comes to mind when the planning commissions that were involved, first of course San Diego County, I guess, if there was one.
I doubt if there was one.
And, but then subsequently Riverside, and finally of course the individual planning organizations for the cities down here went into this. How do you suppose they went about deciding what was going to be where? Was it somebody walking in saying, I want to do this, or was it more, this is what ought to be there?
Well, I'm sure initially, in the early days, it was, I want to do this type thing, and they say, yeah, go ahead and do it. I think as the city incorporated, and you had some people with concerns that you don't want a rendering plant next to a fine hotel, that'd be a little absurd, but I mean, those are the things that incorporation provided the citizens, that there could be some control, that you weren't having obnoxious developments against a residential area. And zonings could be set up, and this is where your zoning ordinance comes from, that you go from a single family residential, you try to buffer that with a multifamily residential, and then into commercial, and then ultimately into an industrial use, so that you have a plan. That's why you call it a planning commission, because you have a good general plan from which development can take place.
Do you know anything about how they would have worked out things like the courses of the rivers? Now I know, of course, the natural courses of the Whitewater Channel, for example, or the Tahquitz Channel were well defined.
Very well defined.
But would they ever have tried to change those?
Number one, the Whitewater would be very difficult to try to do any major changes. You can contain it. This is what the changes that would be, was a containment. Instead of letting the river just flood over an entire area, you build banks and you keep it in a prescribed location. Down valley, the Whitewater River meandered all through the valley, and the Water District, Coachella Valley Water District, a number of years ago went through and quote containment program and took out a lot of the loops and bends and straightened the channel out, and did realign it in many areas to an orderly situation, such as it goes through Thunderbird Country Club right now. Originally there was a big dog leg in that general area, and they straightened it out. And,
well, really, that's how a lot of the country clubs came into being.
That's correct.
Because you can't put houses in that channel.
That's correct.
But you can put golf courses.
And it's worked very well.
Isn't that hard to plant the lawn? If it gets washed out, you just go out and plant it again.
And ironically, once that lawn is planted and gets a good base in, it will probably stay there and let the flood will go right over the top of it.
I suppose that's true. How about some of the events along the years that you remember as things that kind of stand out in your memory of your life here as a young person, or even when you were a little older? What were some of the really exciting things?
Well, I think one of the things we were talking about at breakfast, Dad was obviously very much involved in the city in its infancy, and the volunteer fire department, because that's basically what we had at that point. And there was a big horn on top of the fire station, and that would blast, and 3 o'clock in the morning you could hear that all over town, even way up in the north end. And 3 blasts was
that was how you knew if there was a fire?
That's how you knew it was a fire. There were 3 blasts, it was the north end, and 2 blasts, it was the south end, and 4 blasts was downtown.
What was 1 blast?
I don't know what 1 blast.
They figured you wouldn't hear that.
That's right. So, and I remember we had a big thunderstorm in about 1938, 39, in the middle of the summer, and the blast went off, and 3 o'clock in the morning. And we got up, and Dad ran off to the fire department, and the Pueblo Hotel was on fire. And what's that called today now, Bill?
Well, it was the Sands,
yeah,
I think, for a while.
But anyway,
now it's Quality Inn.
Quality Inn. The lightning had struck the air conditioning unit. And the air conditioning unit in those days, for insulation, they used sawdust. And it struck this sawdust wrapping and set the thing on fire. And it was a big thing. In the middle of summer, you had to have something to do. One of the other interesting things I remember, that the fire department got their first ambulance. If I recall, it was a 1938 Plymouth. And they bought it from Redlands. And Dad, and I don't know who the other fellow, went up to pick it up. And I got to go along. And so coming back, Dad said, "Why don't you lay back there on the gurney?" And so I laid back on the gurney, and it was, 7, 8-year-old kid. This was a lot of fun. And the red light and siren, they had to try it all the way from Redlands to Palm Springs. We came red light and siren all the way down.
And when you got here, the whole town knew it.
Everybody knew we were here. The ambulance had finally arrived. And of course, in those days, the closest hospital was Riverside. So an ambulance was very important.
Yeah, it would have been.
And I know it was in Riverside because in 1945 I had appendicitis. And Dr. Staley was our doctor. P.A. Staley was an old pioneer around here. He said to Dad, he says, "Get John to Riverside." And I remember the old highway was nothing but a bunch of bumps and holes where he went over the washes and all the way to Riverside. I think Dad never went below 90 miles an hour, and every time that car came down I would feel it.
Oh, I'll bet. Well, you must have had someplace to go for medical care down here.
Even
as a child.
Yes, there were the doctors, Dr. Reed, Dr. Staley, and I can't think of the fellow that came before him.
Well, let's see, there was a Dr. Coker.
Dr. Coker. I don't know. He was
early.
But it was basically Dr. Reed and Dr. Staley that I knew growing up. And any emergency or surgical thing, you had to go to Riverside. Right shortly after the end of the Second World War, when the military was still here, they would accept civilians on an emergency basis. And then, of course, when they phased out, and ultimately Desert Hospital was formed out of the old military complex.
I have to ask you, is it as much fun being a civil engineer now as it would have been in those early days?
No. No. Much more fun in those, even 30 years ago was more fun. It's just too hard to do business anymore.
You had to like sand in your ears, though, to
oh yes,
be successful in those days.
A lot of sand in the ears, and
and you had to know how to outrun sidewinders.
Sidewinders, that's true. That's true. We didn't have the fancy equipment in those days, like a surveyor's chain. I can remember chaining across the desert in the middle of the summer with a 300-foot long Surveyor's chain, which was a steel tape. Very hard to hold. We don't use those anymore. Everything's done electronically with either laser beams or electronic radio impulse.
Laser beams?
Yes, we have laser beams.
The world has changed.
That sure has.
What would Mother Kaufman have thought of that?
Yeah, right.
Who will ever know? John, thanks for sharing an hour with us.
Bill, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been really neat hearing about the early days as you remember them as a child and sharing some of your knowledge about land growth and land development here in the Valley. It's an important subject because the planning and thoughts of those early people has greatly affected everything that has happened since.
No question, and I think that our early founding fathers, and I'm saying the Phil Boyds, Alva Hicks, P.T. Stevens, Culver Nichols, when the city was incorporated, they really set it in the right direction, and I think it's done very well.
Well, thanks a lot. John Sanborn, and a conversation about his experiences here in Palm Springs as a child and a little bit of his knowledge, which is vast, on land growth and development. I'm Bill Hesson for Prickly Pears.